Unit 4 will cover the three branches of government: Congress, the lawmaking branch of government, the presidency, which is the branch of government that carries out the laws, and the courts, which is the branch of government that adjudicates or determines what the laws actually mean. To understand the legislature, you have to put it in some kind of a historical context. Uh, of course, our first government, the Articles of Confederation, consisted of only a legislature. Just a single legislature, no executive branch, no judicial branch, and that legislature was very limited in the kind of powers it had and the kind of things it could do. Because at this point, under the Articles of Confederation, the states were the sovereign entity of the government. They had final say over everything, and so they did not want a strong and powerful national government. So they gave the national government, when they created the Articles of Confederation, they gave the legislature in the Articles of Confederation very few powers. It was a weak government with very little power to accomplish anything. Some major flaws, such as the inability to collect taxes, the inability to regulate commerce. So these kind of problems uh, were uh, were inherent with this type of government. And of course, the United States wanted to be a strong government on the world stage, a strong power on the world stage, and they were unable to do that without without a strong central or national government. And so they decided to go ahead and change the government. But the initial goal, when they established the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, was to basically revise the Articles of Confederation. But once they got there, it was proposed that they start from scratch. That they determined. James Madison argued that the Articles of Confederation were not salvageable, and so they began debating over um, what shape the new government would take. Well, it was basically divided. The Constitutional Convention was divided between two factions: large states and small states. Of course, there was the other factions created by the slave states versus free states debate, which we'll talk about in a little while. But the large state versus the small state debate centered around how to determine representation for each state in the legislature. The the small states liked the way it was in the Articles of Confederation, where each state had equal power. Each state had the same number of votes, and so each state had equal influence within the government. The larger states, the more populous states, argued that this was not fair. That they have more people, they give more to the economy with their larger states, so they should have uh, more influence in government, more seats in the legislature, and they demanded what we call proportional representation, which is basically representation in the national legislature proportionate to the number of people you have, or the amount of taxes you pay. And this was going to be this could end the Constitutional Convention, this disagreement. So they came to a compromise, something that we now call the Great Compromise. And it was this: there would be a bicameral legislature, meaning there would be two bodies of Congress, two houses to the legislature, bicameral. One would be the House of Representatives. It would be based on population. That is a win for the large states. They're very likely to control the House of Representatives because the larger states will have more members. These members of the House of Representatives will serve a 2-year term. At minimum, they must be 25 years old, and they must be a U.S. resident for 7 years and a legal resident of the state. The other House of Congress, the Senate, would be equal. So that's a win for the small states. 2 senators per state. They would serve 6-year terms. The minimum age requirement is 30 years old, and they must be a U.S. resident for 9 years and a legal resident of the state. The reason that they have different term limits and different qualifications is basically the founders were trying to balance. Once again, part of the checks and balances system. They wanted them competing with each other. They wanted the House of Representatives to be very responsive to the people. Therefore, 2-year terms. You always have to be pleasing the people if you're going to be elected on every 2 years. The Senate, on the other hand, they wanted them to look more long term, to see the big picture, and allowed them 6-year terms in order to implement whatever policies they prefer. Now, the powers of Congress, or the powers of the legislature, are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. These are called the enumerated powers. The enumerated powers. Enumerated means listed. And they include the power to lay and collect taxes. That means they can tax you and collect the taxes. They can borrow money. Congress may borrow money. They don't have to, but they have the power to do so. Regulate commerce. And what they mean by this is regulate commerce between states or interstate commerce. Uh, Congress was not given the power to regulate intrastate commerce, which is commerce taking place strictly within the boundaries of the state, but interstate commerce. Of course, as we're going to see later, the definition of interstate commerce has varied widely over time. Establish rules for naturalization and bankruptcy, coin money, and punish counterfeiting. Of course, the Secret Service is in charge of investigating counterfeiting. Establish post office, issue patents and copyrights for intellectual property, create courts inferior to the U.S. Supreme Court. As we're going to see, Article 3 establishes the U.S. Supreme Court, but doesn't establish anything else. It gives Congress the power to create the lower courts, the district courts, the appellate courts. Only the U.S. Supreme Court is established in the U.S. Constitution. Declare war and raise and support an army or navy. Only Congress may declare war. Of course, as we'll see, the president has the power to conduct the war, but he cannot do so unless it is declared by Congress and money is raised by Congress to fund the war. And finally, in Article 1, Section 8, is something called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And it basically allows Congress great leeway in creating laws to help them implement the enumerated powers. And it says Congress may make any law that is necessary and proper for carrying out the enumerated powers. So that it gives Congress great flexibility in passing just about any law they want, as long as they can justify it by saying, well, we have to do this to lay and collect taxes. We have to do this to regulate commerce. We have to do this to issue patents and copyrights. It's called the implied clause because it means that Congress can do things that are implied to be able to carry out the rest of their powers. It's also called the elastic clause because it stretches the power of Congress and allows it to do much more than the listed enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. Now, since the Great Compromise included the provision for the House of Representatives, uh, the members of the House of Representatives from each state to be determined by population, it's necessary that we know who lives where. And after every 10 years, there's a census where we count everybody in the United States to determine where they live. And the first one was done in 1790. And this is important because you have to know how many people live in each state in order to determine how many seats would be allocated to those states. And then every 10 years they recount everybody, and then if there is a shift in population, if some people, let's say for instance that Virginia has 12 representatives based on their population, and Tennessee has 4. Well, let's say a large portion of Virginians move to Tennessee, and once you, well, through the formula that they use, once you determine that Tennessee has gained enough population and Virginia has lost enough population, it can be determined that Virginia potentially could lose seats because the amount of representation is based on population, and Tennessee could gain seats. The process of redistributing these seats, of taking some seats away from some states, giving them to other states, is called reapportionment. Okay, and it's based on the changes in population. Okay, reapportionment is the redistribution of congressional seats among the states based on population changes. So some states will add seats, some states will lose seats. Now, redistricting. Once reapportionment happens and the states receive their new number of representatives, it is possible that they have gained seats. And if that's true, then they have to redraw the districts in their state to accommodate the new congressional districts, because every square inch of land in a state has to be represented in Congress. So let's say Tennessee, for instance, has two representatives. That means it basically splits the state in half. Well, if they pick up another seat, if they add a seat, then they have to redraw those two districts in such a way to accommodate one more. So that instead of it being half and half, it has to be in thirds. Or for that's just an example. That doesn't have to be perfectly in thirds, but the population has to be divided into thirds. So therefore, the districts will need to be redrawn and reshaped to accommodate the new seat. That's the process of redistricting, and that is done by the state legislatures. The national government reapportions, the state legislatures redistrict once the change in number of representations is determined. Now, one of the problems with this redistricting process is something called gerrymandering, and this is the shaping of the districts in order to give an advantage, an unfair advantage to a certain political party or a certain group of people or a certain economic interest, a certain religious group. So because you can just draw the districts pretty much any way you want, there are people out there who want to draw it in such a way that benefits them or their political party or their interest. So it would be nothing for a state legislature, since it's happened many times in history, where state legislatures will draw districts in order to ensure that a certain political party or certain groups of people do not win a district. You can draw a district in such a way where the minority population consists, it's 20% minority in every single district, and therefore that minority population will never have representation in Congress. Now, once members of Congress are elected, they become what we call incumbents. When they run for re-election, they have something called the incumbency advantage over their challenger. So if I win an election, the next time I run, either in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, I will have a built-in advantage to win that election. These advantages include name recognition. If I'm already a member of Congress, people probably have already heard of me. So that is one of the biggest hurdles to winning an election, is people knowing who you are. If somebody walks up to vote and looks at the ballot and there's two people they don't really know anything about, but they recognize one of the names, they'll probably vote for that name, not even knowing why they remember the name. Also, they can claim credit. An incumbent can claim credit for positive things that's happening in the district, for jobs that were brought to the district, for new roads that are built. Also, incumbents can take claim for casework, meaning all casework is helping the constituents in your district. Helping them get, resolve problems with the government, with the IRS or whatever. Also, an incumbent has access to media. If some event happens, the local television stations are going to want to interview somebody, and oftentimes they want to interview um, the member of Congress, and that's free media, that's free advertising. Also, because of the incumbency advantage, they're more likely to raise more money because people bet on winners. And people that give money to campaigns, most of them know that the incumbent wins about 80% of the time. And so if they're going to donate money to a campaign in order to have influence in Congress, then you want to try to give money to the winner, which is generally the incumbent. Of course, the incumbent also brings experience to Congress, and the incumbent can be helped in their attempts at reelection by redistricting by the state legislature. The state legislature, after a census, can redraw the district of that incumbent in such a way as to make it easier for them to win. Now let's talk a little bit about the demographics of Congress. And the demographics, I'm talking currently about what Congress looks like. Of course, with some exceptions, it's not much different than it has been throughout American history. If you take a look at the makeup of the members of the U.S. Congress, on average, they're better educated than the average citizen or the average society. Um, a large portion, almost 100%, have bachelor's degrees, and many of them have graduate degrees, either master's degrees or professional degrees, such as law degrees or medical degrees. Uh, Members of Congress tend to be richer than the average American. Of course, many of them, that because they're rich, that can allow them to run for Congress because it's very expensive running for Congress. And also, they're wider than the average Americans. Uh, Anglos or white people make up a little less than, um, I guess, 50% of the total population. No, that's Texas. Well, uh, the percentage of whites in Congress as compared to the number of um, minority racial groups is much larger than the percentage of whites compared to the minority groups in the general population. And Congress is much maler than the general population. There are more females than there are males in American society, yet Congress is made up of a large majority of males. Now, theories of representation. Theories of representation. When you are elected to Congress, there's a couple of ways you can go about your job. You can. Some people argue, and some representatives do, act as trustees. And a trustee theory of representation is the idea that you are elected based on the fact that you have good judgment and you have persuaded your constituents that you have good judgment, and they allow you to make your constituents allow you to make decisions and to vote in a way that you think is right, that you think best represents that district and the United States. They trust you, therefore you're a trustee. Or you could be a delegate. And basically, what a delegate does is simply vote the way their constituents want. So, on every vote, they would, you know, kind of either do a public opinion poll or just kind of feel out the feelings of their constituents back home and vote the way they want them to all the time, regardless of whether the actual representative believes that it's the right vote or not. It doesn't matter if you're a delegate what the representative himself believes. He only votes the way his representatives want. Most politicians are a hybrid of these two, and they are called politicos. Politicos. They are a trustee on some issues and a delegate on others. And generally, they on the high-profile issues, the issues that are in the news, the issues that the news talk shows are talking about, the social issues, the wedge issues, gay marriage or immigration, something like that, that are hot button issues, they act as a delegate because the constituents pay attention to those votes. But on almost all other issues that aren't high profile, minor tax issues, minor foreign policy issues, just farm bills, things like that, a lot of times, uh, they act as trustees because the constituents don't have a lot of knowledge of the issue, and generally the constituents don't care, so they just let the representative act as a trustee. Now, when you do go to vote, even if you are a trustee and you're allowed to vote however you want, you have a lot of things to think about with regard to that decision. There's a lot of influences on your vote. Your own party. Your party has an agenda. Your political party that you belong to has an agenda. They have something they want to accomplish, and that may be in contrast to what you want to accomplish or what may be best for your district. So you have to always take that into account. Of course, you have to take your constituents into account. These are the people that elected you. These are the people that live in your district. So they are paramount in your decision making. You also have to take into account colleagues and caucuses. Colleagues are just people you work with. You might have do favors for each other. You might learn things from your colleagues, learn things that you didn't know about the issue. Caucuses are also small groups within the party or within Congress that come together for a common purpose. The Congressional Black Caucus, for example, is a caucus of African American members of Congress who discuss the concerns of their constituents, of African Americans. Interest groups and PACs are also something that are in the decision-making process because they can influence voters, but they also give a lot of money to campaigns, and you don't want to lose that money if you get it. So If you received a lot of money from a political action committee or an interest group the last election and you don't vote in their favor during this cycle, well, they might take that money from you. Staff and support agencies, these are basically agencies within Congress that provide you information on different issues and different bills. They crunch numbers for you as far as how a bill might impact the budget. And then just individual characteristics. This oftentimes can trump everything. What does the member of Congress personally feel about an issue? How is their background or their religion or their upbringing? How's it going to impact their vote? Maybe a bill dealing with you know poor children and feeding poor children. Maybe that member of Congress grew up poor. That might shape the way that person votes. So there's a lot of decision-making influence on members of Congress. This graphic shows the increase in the number of women, African American, and Hispanics over time since 1945 in Congress, and these are just raw numbers. So in the 79th Congress, which was in 1945, there were, see, blue is women, so there are about, looks like 12 women, maybe two African Americans and one Hispanic. And then over time, you can see that the bars gradually increase. So representation of each of those groups have increased quite a bit, although none of them are still in exact approximation to their representation in the general population. This graphic shows the contradiction that many Americans have between how they feel about their own members of Congress and Congress as a whole. As you can see on the left-hand side, percentage approving, the up and down line, and then across it's the poll dates when these questions were asked. And the two questions they asked were, do you approve or disapprove of the way Congress is handling its job? That means Congress as a whole, and that's the blue line. And then they asked the question, do you approve or disapprove of the way the representative from your district is handling his or her job? And that's the red line. So you have a line showing the approval of your own member of Congress and your line showing your approval of Congress as a whole. And what it shows very clearly is that there's a disconnect between how people feel about Congress as a whole and how they feel about their own member of Congress. Which basically, we all complain about Congress, but then we think it's all the other members of Congress's fault that they're failures or whatever. But it's not our Congress members' fault. It's a lot of it's because it's instinctive to take ownership of somebody that is closer to us or that we chose or that belongs to us, and we tend to be more empathetic, sympathetic, and also more tolerant of those types of people. It's like, for those of you that have children, it would be like you know judging your children versus judging other children or children as a whole. Most all other children, all children are just wild and bad or whatever, but not my kids. My kids are okay. But anyway, this just shows a little disconnect between how we feel about our own members of Congress and how we feel about Congress as a whole. One of the most important mechanisms that make Congress work, or I won't say make it work, but it helps facilitate getting things done, are the role of parties. The political parties. Both the House and the Senate have political party structures. Uh, and of course, they consist of alternating oftentimes the majority party and the minority party. And just by definition, the majority party is the party with the most members, and the minority party is the party with the second most members. And you might have at some point in time you might have minor parties that are coming third or fourth or fifth as far as the number of members. But we break it up in our system between majority party and minority party. And because we are a two-party system, Republicans and Democrats, that makes it simple to do. Uh, and it pays dividends to be the majority party. The majority party controls most committees, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute, because committees set the agenda. They get to decide what bills come up for a vote. When the bills initially go to committee, they get to decide what to do with them, whether they'll even get out of committee. And they are also, considering that the chairpersons of the committees are of the majority party for the most part, they can dictate the kind of changes that might be implemented to a bill. So the majority party has great power in the committees, and by extension, those committees very um, have pretty extensive power with regard to whether bills get to the floor for a vote and get passed. Now, within each party, and sometimes these might cross over party lines, but it's rare. But within each party, there are things like called the party caucus, the party caucuses, and these are just the groups of the party members by themselves that elect party leaders. They hand out committee assignments. They kind of dictate what the policy priorities will be. They try to determine, well, what are we going to focus on first? What is the most important thing we want to do? Is it economic policy? Is it foreign policy? Is it education policy? And they'll make these determinations. They discipline other members of the party, maybe for not voting the way they're supposed to vote in an important election or an important vote over a bill, and they generally set the agenda, especially the majority party. If the caucuses within the majority party can set the agenda for the entire Congress, but even in the minority party, they can set an agenda for what their priorities will be and uh, what they want to accomplish in this legislative session. Now, there are really four different kinds of committees that we want to concern ourselves with. One, standing committee. It is a permanent committee that that exists, that specializes in a certain um, policy area. So you have both the House and the Senate have their own standing committees, and we'll look at a list of those in a minute. But basically, uh, like the House Banking Committee or the House Committee on Foreign Affairs or the Senate Banking Committee, and any bill that gets submitted to Congress, the Senate or the House, will go to the committee that is most appropriate for that. So if there's a bill that's been presented to the House Representatives that deals with the banking industry, well, it will go to the Banking Committee. And these standing committees are permanent, and they exist on a permanent basis. There's also joint committees that join both House members and Senate members. Usually they are to investigate some major problem that arose. You can have a joint committee on, I don't know, on some criminal activity or something. You have select committees that are put together for a specific purpose. Select committees tend to try to solve single problems. Uh, well, actually, a good example would be like post 9/11. There were joint committees and select committees investigating, why 9/11 happened. What were the failures of the FBI and the CIA and the intelligence community and all these things. So these committees are put together for specific purposes. Joint committees mainly for investigations, select committees for to implement certain policies potentially that can fix those problems. Then you have conference committees. Conference committees are established to reconcile two different versions of the same bill that come out of the House and the Senate. Uh, and what this means is that usually a bill that is submitted for consideration is either submitted to the House of Representatives or to the Senate. And as we know, it has to pass both before it can become law. So if it's submitted to the House of Representatives, they will go through their process of submitting it to a committee, changing it, adding things, taking things out, putting it up for a vote in the House of Representatives. And if they pass it, they will send that bill, that completed bill, over to the Senate. But the Senate will go through the same process. It'll enter into a committee. They may change it. They may add amendments. They may take things out. And then they go through that process. And then they pass it. So the House has passed the bill. The Senate's passed the bill. But the Senate changed the one the House passed. So you have two different bills. You cannot send a bill to the President unless it has been the exact same bill has been passed by both houses of Congress. So what the conference committee does, it takes members of, usually it's the committees of both the House and the Senate that initially dealt with the bill, that initially dealt with the bill, and they will sit into a conference and they will work out the difference, and they will come up with a new bill. And then when they come up with a compromise bill, they will send that bill to both the House and the Senate, and they will vote on it. And of course, if they both pass it, then it will go to the president for his signature. And if they don't, they go back to the drawing board. Here's a chart that shows, or a table that shows all the different committees. As you can see, some of them are overlapping. The House and the Senate have many similar committees, like the House Committee on Agriculture, and you also have the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. House Appropriations, appropriations is spending. House Appropriations Committee, Senate Appropriations Committee. House Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee. All those are standing committees. They are permanent, and they are the committees by which all bills that enter into Congress pass through. Okay, so the committees will touch the bill first before it gets to the floor for any other action. Of course, at the bottom, there are select, special, and other committees, joint committees, permanent committee, secret permanent and select intelligence committee, the select homeland security committee, Senate, and then joint committees. Both the House and the Senate have leadership structures, which helps them process legislation, and of course, the leadership positions also help the parties function. First, you have the House Representatives. The leader of the House Representatives, by constitutional mandate, is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, or as we call him, the Speaker of the House. He represents the entire House Representatives, both parties, and is elected by the entire House at the beginning of every 2-year session. Each session of the legislature lasts 2 years. That's why they have elections every 2 years. The Speaker of the House oversees the legislative agenda, meaning that he makes sure the things go through the processes they're supposed to go through. And also, he has the power to prevent certain types of legislation from being voted on if he so chooses to, but he has to be careful in doing that not to offend too many people. He's generally the spokesperson for the House of Representatives. It's the first person a lot of the media, national media, go to for their opinion on the legislative process in the House of Representatives, and he is also second in line to the presidency. So, in order of a succession, you have the president, the vice president, and then the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And while he is the most powerful person in Congress, his power relative to other speakers has varied over time. There's some periods where the Speaker of the House was a very, very powerful person. I think around the late 1800s, and then there's times when not so much, where the Speaker of the House is weak or ineffectual and just doesn't get things done in a way that others had. Now, as I said, the Speaker of the House represents the entire House of Representatives. The majority party elects their own majority leader, whose job is to set the agenda, provide leadership, and provide accountability to the majority party. And the minority leader does the same thing, elected by their own party. Both the majority leader and the minority leader are elected by only their party members. Other non-party members don't vote. The minority leader does the same thing as the majority leader, leads the party, sets the agenda, metes out punishment, tries to organize the party in such a way as to promote their agenda. And underneath the leaders, the majority and minority leaders are what's called the whips. You have the House whip and the Senate whips, and basically these are members of leadership whose job is to ensure that the membership of the party votes the way they're supposed to vote. I like to think of the way I remember it, whips is they whip their party members into shape by making them vote the way they're supposed to vote, lining them up to support the things that the party wants supported. So that's the House of Representatives. The Senate, the presiding officer of the Senate, officially by Constitution, is the Vice President of the United States. Now, that's confusing because the Vice President is part of the executive branch. But here he is also, by Constitution, the presiding officer of the Senate. What he really does, though, the Vice President, he or she, would be to break a tie. Considering there's always an even number of members of the Senate, it's likely that a tie might occasionally happen. So somebody has to break the tie, and that is the Vice President of the United States. Uh, the official chair, the person that presides over the day-to-day operations of the Senate, is the President pro tempore, usually the most senior member of the Senate. And because they're the most senior member, they don't have to actually do the work. They usually delegate that work, you know, hitting the gavel, recognizing different speakers on the floor. They usually delegate those duties to junior members of the Senate. So those junior members actually run the day-to-day operations of the show, or lead the day-to-day operations of the Senate. And within the Senate, there's both a majority and a minority leader, much like in the House of Representatives, and they are whips as well. The structure is similar, just as far as the top leadership, um, the names change a little bit. Now, this is just a flow chart that shows the leadership positions within the House and the Senate. You have the Speaker of the House at the top in the House of Representatives, and under the Speaker you have the committee system with the committee chairs and the members of the committees. But also under the Speaker fall the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader, and then on down through the whips, the caucus, and other other parts of the leadership structure. In the Senate, you have the president, the vice president, or president pro tempore of the Senate. As I mentioned before, vice president is really just a symbolic leader of the Senate, and the committee system, and then the majority and minority leaders, and on down. So the structure system is very similar in the House and the Senate. Now let's take a look at some historical functions of the legislature of the U.S. Congress. First, the budgetary function of Congress. Prior to 1921, Congress had the power to write the budget. Each individual federal government agency, would come to Congress and individually ask for money, either go to the committee that oversaw it, or would ask Congress specifically for money. So the Department of Defense would go ask Congress for money. The IRS, or no, not IRS at that time, but every agency would go and ask, and there weren't that many agencies at that time, would go ask Congress for money themselves individually. But beginning in the early 1900s, and especially as they get into the 1920s, and especially in the 1930s, the size of the government grew. More and more agencies were formed. And so what happened, the Budget and Accounting Act was passed in 1921. It created the Office of Management and Budget. And what it also did is it allowed the president and the executive branch to create the budget. Because here's how it works: Congress passes all the laws, and Congress funds the government. But all of the agencies that actually carry out the laws that Congress passes are under the control of the executive branch. They're under the control of the government. I mean, the president. So the president and the executive branch, starting with the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, uh, would decide how much money each individual agency required. And so they would create a budget, the executive branch would, and then they would present it to Congress, and then Congress could act on that budget. Either they could, sign off on it and pass the budget as it was, which is rare, or they could alter it and change it and remove things and then send it back to the president for his signature. But it was a very important transition, though, in 1921, from the budget being under the control, or at least the line item budget, where specific money goes, from being under control of the Congress to being under the control of the president. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974 created the Congressional Budget Office, which is basically a part of the executive branch whose only job is to work on the budget year round, crunch the numbers, determine how money should be spent, where it should be spent. Of course, with this comes all kinds of spending, all kinds of specific spending too. And a couple of terms I want you to understand about budgeting and the budgetary function of Congress. One is pork. You'll hear that term on the news a lot. Pork is money and jobs that are specifically directed towards congressional districts in order to help those districts and those actually help those representatives of those districts win their election. And earmarks are funds for specific projects. They may not be for the purpose of helping a legislator, it may be for the purpose of helping a certain individual or a certain institution. So earmarking funds for a specific purpose, not necessarily for a project in a district that will have long-term ramifications. It could be just for a specific building or a super awesome microscope or something. But those are earmarks, funds for specific purposes or specific jobs. Also, Congress has an oversight function, meaning they can, and this is a constitutional function, that they oversee especially the executive branch because they spend the money and the executive branch, I mean they give the money and the executive branch spends the money, and so it's their power, under their power, to make sure this money is spent properly and their laws are implemented properly. The War Powers Act of 1973 rolled back the president's ability to use military troops. That was part of the oversight function after Vietnam War, when the president and the military kind of went outside the parameters set by Congress. Well, the War Powers Act drew them back in and limited the president's power to use the American military in any way he chose. Also, congressional review. They have the ability to nullify agency regulations. So if there's a federal agency under the executive branch and they implement or they create certain regulations, they can nullify them. Okay, they can quit funding them as well. Also, confirmation of presidential nominations. This is one of the big oversights. You know, the president nominates and appoints a lot of people that work in the executive branch, from his cabinet to to heads of administrative agencies, and Congress has the power to confirm many of those. So if the president chooses, you know, bad choices and he chooses unwisely, well, Congress can fix that. Of course, oftentimes, especially if the Congress is of a different party than the president, they'll just use this oversight power to deny confirmations as a political tool to embarrass the president or otherwise. And then finally, impeachment. This is the ultimate oversight of the executive branch. This is the power of Congress to remove the president from office before his term is complete. It is a huge step. It's rarely happened. Two presidents have been impeached. Has been and neither. I'm sorry. Two presidents have been impeached, and neither has been convicted. Andrew Johnson was the first. He was the president after Abraham Lincoln, and then Bill Clinton in the 1990s was impeached, and he was not convicted either. Uh, Impeachment just means that you are put on trial. Impeachment means the House of Representatives has determined that there's enough evidence to put you on trial. The actual doesn't mean you're removed from office. The actual trial takes place in the Senate, and like I said, neither Johnson nor Clinton were convicted. The one president that probably would have been impeached and convicted, but resigned ahead of time before that was to happen, was Richard Nixon over the Watergate scandal. Now, the relationship between Congress and the executive branch has changed over time. Of course, there's always that checks and balances system that we learned about early in the semester that makes sure that neither becomes all too powerful. But early in American history, Congress was by far the most powerful branch of government, mainly because there wasn't a whole lot for the executive branch to do. There wasn't the world problems that they have now, because the executive branch is charged with foreign affairs. So there wasn't the world problems. Also, there wasn't the power of the media and the president to take advantage of the media in order to set his own agenda. But anyway, early congressional power meant that the president was relatively weak, had more of a symbolic power than real power. Then Lincoln, during the Civil War, brings a stronger executive. He has to take executive powers and really extra constitutional powers that caused many people to call him a tyrant. Lincoln brought a stronger executive in order to hold the nation together and to win the war. But once the war was over, of course, Lincoln was assassinated. Uh, Power went back to the relative power went back to Congress. Then in the early 1900s, you see the rise of the strong executive that we see up to this day. It begins with Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century, and then goes through Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression and um, World War II, and every president since has accumulated power, or at least maintained the power that previous presidents had accumulated. 1970s, we talked about the War Powers Act a little bit, in a way that Congress limited the power of the president. One of the few times Congress has been able to actually roll back the power of the president by limiting his power to wage war. But today, especially post 9/11, with the Department of Homeland Security falling under the executive branch and falling under the president, presidents today have unprecedented power. They have today's presidents, beginning with Bush, uh, and now President Obama, have just unprecedented power. No presidents have ever had this much power. The only one that came close was probably Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. But the impact is it has diminished the power of Congress, and it puts a lot of power in the hands of a single individual. And some people argue that it's dangerous that one single individual can have that much power. Although those checks and balances still exist, uh, there's becoming gray areas there. Congress and the judiciary. Congress confirms the appointment of federal judges and Supreme Court justices. They offer senatorial courtesy. The senator of a state that has an opening for a district judge has the courtesy of picking that judge, and the president usually will confirm it. And then impeachment. Congress may impeach federal judges and Supreme Court justices just as they would impeach the president. And in the end, this is just a flow chart showing how bills work their way through Congress. If a bill, look on the left side of the green, if a bill is introduced to the House, first it is referred to a committee, a House committee, and then it's referred to a subcommittee, and then they will work on the bill and vote on it, and then if it is not killed at this point, they will report it to the full committee, and at this point it could be killed, and it will go to a rules committee, and before it gets to the House representatives for a full debate and full vote, it has to pass through the rules committee to determine rules of debate, and then the House debates and votes on passage. And if they pass it, then it goes to the Senate, and many of the similar process, referred to a committee, referred to subcommittee, reported to the full committee, and then it goes to, there is no committee on rules in the Senate. And then it goes to the floor for debate and passage. And if it passes, and it passes differently, in a different form than the House bill, then it goes to the conference committee. And then they work out the differences and send it back, and it's voted on by both. Of course, the process can begin in the Senate. It doesn't have to begin in the House. It can begin in the Senate and work its way back the other way into the House Representatives. And like I said, and after the conference committee, it'll go to House approval and Senate approval. Then it'll go to the president. And then, of course, the president has its options. He can sign it and it becomes law. He can veto it. He can wait 10 days and it becomes law. Or he can wait 10 days, and then if within that 10 days Congress adjourns, it does not become law. It is called a pocket veto. It means at the end of this legislative session, he sticks it in his pocket, does not sign it, and it is effectively vetoed. Now we will move on to the U.S. executive branch, which basically includes the president and all the agencies and things that fall under the power of the president or the executive. First of all, the constitutional basis of the U.S. executive branch, and specifically the president, is found in Article 2 of the Constitution. Of course, Article 1 was Congress or the legislature. Article 2 is the executive branch. And when they set about, the founders who wrote the Constitution, when they set down to uh, create the executive branch, they had specific worries. Their main worry was that uh, they feared that a person who became the executive or who became a president would inevitably refuse to yield power and become tyrannical throughout human history. Uh, the founders, they knew human history and they understood history and they understood human nature, and they feared that when people get power, they refuse to relinquish it. So Their goal was to establish a presidency or an executive that was limited in what it could do, with checks and balances, with limits on its power. And so that's what they created. They created an executive that had limits on its power and had constitutionally uh, constitutional ways to limit the power of the president. So they first of all they had to give the president some powers. Of course, there was no executive under the Articles of Confederation. So this was just, so they had to really take from probably the presidents, the governors of the states to kind of determine what powers they needed and what powers would be necessary to be a successful executive, but not potentially a tyrannical one. So the powers they give is that he's the administrative head of the nation, meaning he's basically the CEO of the nation, because all of the agencies that actually implement the laws um, fall under his power. He's the commander in chief of the armed forces, meaning he commands the military and has the final say on military matters during war. Of course, the Congress has the power to declare war, but the executive branch, as part of the checks and balances system, is the one who carries out the war and is the commander in chief. He has the power to convene Congress when they are not in session. It's usually an event of a crisis or an emergency. The president can veto legislation of Congress. This is a check on Congress that the founders installed in our system. So if Congress passes a law that the president deems improper for whatever reason, the president may veto it. Of course, there is that other check on the president by Congress that if they can muster up two-thirds of a vote of both houses of Congress, they may override the presidential veto. The president has extensive appointment powers to appoint officials, heads of agencies, and ambassadors, and things like that. Now, many of those appointments must be approved by the U.S. Senate. Also, the president has the power to make treaties, or the executive branch has the power to make treaties. Let's put it that way. Usually, that is done by the State Department. The State Department will negotiate treaties, and the president will sign off on them. But occasionally, so there may be a negotiation that is important enough that the president himself actually takes a hand and involves himself directly in the negotiations. And another power of the president granted in the Constitution is the power to grant pardons. That means basically the president can, uh, wipe away the conviction or charge against any person. This by a signing of his pen, he can override a criminal conviction, a civil conviction, and grant pardons to anybody he wishes. And the president doesn't have to give a reason, although most do. Of course, most presidents also grant these pardons at the end of their presidential terms. When they're leaving office, that's when they usually begin to grant pardons. So, what are the requirements to be president of the United States? Well, I break them down between constitutional or formal requirements and informal requirements. The constitutional formal requirements for office to be president are: you must be a U.S. born citizen. It's the only office in the United States where the requirement is that you were born in the United States. All other offices, it doesn't matter where you were born, as long as you're a citizen. You must be 35 years old, which at the time this was implemented was fairly old. That was considered middle age. You must be a 14-year resident in the United States uh, prior to becoming president. Now, that we know the original Constitution had no term limits for the presidency, but the 22nd Amendment was added after Franklin D. Roosevelt was reelected four times to place a two-term limit on the president. So that is a requirement, constitutional requirement for presidents, limiting them to two terms. Now, there are also informal requirements, and these are just requirements of the electorate, or just they're kind of societal requirements, or they just are. This is just how it has been, and there's no rule within, or no clause within the Constitution that states that these things are fact, but It's just how it is. First of all, one of the informal requirements is that you must be male. Every single president of the United States has been a man. Okay, I would venture in the next election or two that that will change, but we'll see. All have been white except the current president. President Obama is of African descent, his father, so he is considered by most people to be black. So uh, most all are white, though, so it'll be interesting to see. Of course, he was elected and then reelected, but it'll be interesting to see uh, the next time we have a non-white president. Uh, when that will be, and whether it will be a Hispanic president, or another black president, or potentially some other non-white race. All but one have been Protestant, and that was John F. Kennedy. He was a Catholic, so that is kind of an informal requirement. While a couple have come close, uh, non Protestants in the 2008, no, take that back, 2012 election, President Obama ran against a man named Mitt Romney who was a Mormon, and that would have been a first. But for the most part, they're Protestant. Of course, even if they're not Protestant, and even if they're not religious, they must claim they are in order to have any possible chance of being elected. Most all are married, not all, but most all are married. A few have gone into office single. Some have been widowed while in office, but most are married, and most are college educated, especially the more recent ones. Uh, but most all have had college educations. The last president without a college degree was Harry Truman, Harry S. Truman. Um, Now, as far as the line of succession, if something happens to the president dies in office, or is impeached from office, or resigns the office, there must be a line of succession. There must be a clear uh, line to follow on who takes his place. So, in the presidential line of succession, first is the vice president. They're number one. They will take the place of the president. After the vice president is the Speaker of the House, second in line. Third in line is the President pro tempore of the Senate. Fourth in line is the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, you know, assuming that the vice president that accedes to the office was elected with the president, the Secretary of State is the first non-elected person that is in line for the presidency. And then the Secretary of the Treasury, number 5, number 6, Secretary of Defense, number 7, Attorney General, number 8, Secretary of Interior, number 9, Secretary of Agriculture, and number 10, Secretary of Commerce. If we get down into the 7s, 8s, and 9s, we are in big trouble. Now let's talk a little bit about impeachment. Impeachment is a constitutional check on the president. It basically is the power of Congress to remove the president from office prior to the end of his or her term. And it's rarely been used, but according to the Constitution, impeachment can be instituted for bribery, treason, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, how this works, and a lot of people misunderstand impeachment and conviction, it's a two-step process. Uh, in order to impeach somebody, a president, you must have a majority of the House of Representatives vote that there is enough evidence to put the president on trial. So what would happen is lawyers or whoever would present evidence to the entire House of Representatives, and then the House of Representatives would examine that evidence and determine whether there is enough evidence to put the president on trial, much like a grand jury would look at evidence to see if you could put you or me on trial. If it is determined there is enough evidence by a majority vote in the House of Representatives to to put the president on trial, the president has been impeached. Now, at this point, the president has not been convicted of anything. The president has not it's not been proven that they've committed any crime, and they have not been removed from office. The impeachment is much like an indictment. It just means that there is enough evidence to put them on trial. Then, if that happens, uh, it goes to a trial in the Senate. Of course, the trial, the entire Senate is considered the jury. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over as as the judge of the trial, and it's just like any other trial. Evidence is produced, witnesses are produced, and the only difference is instead of 12 jurors, there are 100 jurors. And then once all the evidence is put forth, then the Senate or jury votes. And if 2/3 of the Senate vote to impeach, vote to convict, and then the process is complete, and the president is removed from office. Um, so just to understand that if somebody's impeached, they haven't been convicted of anything. Two presidents have been impeached: Andrew Johnson, who was the president after Abraham Lincoln, and Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Neither Johnson nor Clinton were convicted. Johnson came the closest. He missed conviction by one vote in the Senate. Clinton missed conviction by a wide margin. Now, another important principle with regard to the president is executive privilege. Executive privilege isn't listed in the Constitution, but it is implied in some of the constitutional powers. It is an implied presidential power that allows the president to refuse to disclose information regarding confidential conversations on national security to Congress or the judiciary. And basically, the president has his advisors. And in order for the president to carry out his job properly, he must get unfettered, uh, unfiltered advice from his advisors. And so he needs just the bold, honest truth from the people he talks to, and he must give them his honest opinions and what he really thinks. Well, as we know through life, honest opinions offend people. Honest opinions make people mad. So what this and also honest opinions can harm national security. If you talk about some secret thing that is happening in another country or even happening in your own country, and it gets out, well, it's no longer secret, but also you've tipped off you know, the criminal or whoever. So the idea is that the president should be able to talk to his closest advisors without having to tell Congress everything they talk about or tell the judiciary everything they talk about so he can have free and open conversations. So presidents oftentimes have stated, that I'm not going to come before Congress and talk about this because of executive privilege. But this is not an absolute power. And the one case where the Supreme Court ruled that executive privilege did not apply was in the case of U.S. versus Nixon. That was during Richard Nixon's presidency when he was being investigated for the Watergate crimes, which that's can't go into that right now, but it's in your American history class you will learn about that. But the Watergate crimes, where Nixon was found to be knee deep in criminal activity and had discussed it with people in the White House. He had taped everything that he talked about in the White House. Well, when they were investigating Watergate, the Justice Department subpoenaed the Nixon White House tapes, all the recordings of his conversations. He refused, citing executive privilege, but the Supreme Court overruled that, and he ended up having to turn over the tapes. But most famously, when he turned them over, there was like 14 minutes that were erased, that were gone, and nobody to this day has admitted knowing what was on those 14 minutes. Of course, probably nobody will. Now, presidential power has changed over time from a relatively weak position to a more powerful position. Early presidents were generally weak because Congress uh, held most of the power. Congress is generally the most powerful branch of government during the late 1700s, even into the 1800s. Washington, he kind of exerted his authority by forming his own cabinet, taking control of foreign policy, and of course he set the precedent for two terms in office for future presidents. Um, but he didn't involve himself too much in domestic affairs. Thomas Jefferson also didn't involve himself a lot in domestic affairs. He did kind of set the precedent for inherent powers or implied powers of the presidency, or powers that you just presidents need to have in order to function. And this was represented in the Louisiana Purchase, which some people argued he didn't have the authority to complete. That the Louisiana Purchase was beyond the powers of the executive branch. Uh, and then Andrew Jackson, he increased the power of the president, at least with regard to public influence, with his presidency in the era of Jacksonian democracy in the beginning in 1828. He was really the first common man president, the first president that wasn't probably descendant from one of the early founders that came across uh, on the Mayflower and just after. He also during Jackson's presidency, white male suffrage became very common, which means all white men were able to vote by this point. Still, of course, no women or people of color, but white male suffrage was pretty prevalent at this point, and it began the mass party system during Jackson's presidency. He used this mass party system to gain support and to win re-election. Party support began to come up from the grassroots level instead of just political party and party issues being what the elites concerned themselves with. Now the average person identified themselves with the political parties. Now Lincoln was the first president to really just expand immensely the powers of the presidency to serve a specific purpose. And he did that to save the Union during the Civil War. He assumed many powers that many, even at the time, and many even today, consider unconstitutional, such as suspending habeas corpus or the right to a speedy trial, blocking mail, imprisoning people for, especially Northerners in the Union, for speaking out against the war. So Lincoln, of course, he did what he had to do to accomplish his goal of saving the Union, but he did expand presidential power. But one thing we have to remember is that after the war was over, and of course Lincoln was assassinated, but even after that, the executive power that had been accumulated during the war for the president reverted back to Congress. They did not hold that power. Uh, Now, the rise of the modern presidency, in the modern times, the presidency is a much more important office than it was in the early part of our history. The president has much more influence, especially over domestic policy. The first real, probably modern powerful president was Theodore Roosevelt, who argued that really it was only the president of the United States. That's the only office that had the true interest of the American people as a whole at heart, because he argued that a member of the House of Representatives, while they are a member of that large body of the House of Representatives, they are only elected by their constituents in their district within their state. Therefore, that's who they truly represent. And of course, a U.S. senator is elected strictly from the inside the borders of that state that they're from, and only the people within that state elect that person. So in reality, that senator only has that state's constituents' concerns as being paramount. The only official that is elected nationwide by all Americans is the President of the United States. So oftentimes, members of the House of Representatives, members of the Senate, their constituents' priorities may not be the same priorities as what's in the best interest of the American people. So Theodore Roosevelt saw himself as protecting the interests of the American people against sometimes the House and the Senate. Now his cousin Franklin Roosevelt was maybe did more to expand presidential power than any other president. Of course, he was the president during the Great Depression and the New Deal, which in that period of time, probably at that period of time, expanded the size and scope of government more than any other time period and any other president. He was also president during World War II, when under his watch, basically the U.S. government took control of the economy of the United States and converted it into a wartime economy, converting factories that were making domestic products uh, or non-war products, converting them to making war products. Also, he was the only president to serve more than 2 terms. He served 4 terms in office, and of course, after that, a constitutional amendment was passed to make it the law that only 2 terms would be the limit for any president. And so during his presidency, he expanded the power of the president both domestically and in foreign policy. Then in the 1970s, the War Powers Act was passed by Congress to limit presidential power with regard to use of the military. This was in response to President Nixon and President Johnson's use of the military in the Vietnam War. Johnson and Nixon both were accused of moving beyond presidential mandate. I mean, beyond what the Congress mandated in the resolutions giving them power to use the military, and so they pulled back the power of the presidents to use the military in any way they saw fit. And then, of course, more recently, in our modern times, George W. Bush and Barack Obama both have had to face what we now know as the War on Terror. And of course, this War on Terror is different than any other war, because most wars, you know when you win a war, you know when the end of the war is. Either you control the territory of your enemy surrenders, or you kill the leadership of the enemy. But the problem is, we do not understand, and we have no concept now of how the War on Terror might ever end, because the terrorists come from everywhere, and therefore you can't really control the territory of the enemy. There is no specific leader of the terror, so no one person can surrender for the terrorists, and you can't kill the individual leader of the terrorists because there is not one individual leader. So during wartime, there's reduced oversight of the executive branch by Congress, and there's more secrecy. But usually, when wars end, those things end. And but the problem is, by definition, the war on terror will never end because there's no way to win it. And there is a group of people we call the presidential establishment. The presidential establishment. It includes those closest to the president, the advisors, and others who help him do his job, and it's a very difficult job. Probably the most high-profile person in the presidential establishment would be the vice president. Um, Constitutionally, he isn't given a lot of powers in the executive branch, or very little, if any, powers in the executive branch. And the only real power that's given to him in the Constitution is that he presides over the Senate, basically doing the job of breaking the tie of a Senate vote. It's been a historically weak office. Usually, nobody wanted to be vice president. It was just a thankless job because the president is the final decision maker, and oftentimes throughout history, presidents have felt threatened by the vice president, that they're out to get their job. But it's been a historically weak office. But more modern presidents, and specifically the last three, have been have actually had policy power and have been given responsibility for major initiatives within the administration. Probably the first would be Al Gore with President Clinton, who's President Clinton's vice president, uh, who played a pretty big role in helping Clinton implement his policies. Vice President Dick Cheney, who is the president's George W. Bush's vice president, was very instrumental in foreign policy. Also, and arguably he was the most influential person in pushing the United States into the Iraq War. And then, of course, Joe Biden, who is President Barack Obama's vice president, is also very important and very instrumental in shaping the president's foreign policy. Also, the vice president is chosen for specific reasons to help the president win election. Either for regional balance or political balance. Regional balance because the president has to win, hopefully, all parts of the country. They want to pick a vice president that appeals to some other part of the country than they themselves come from. So, say, if you had a southern candidate for president, you would pick a northern vice presidential candidate to be his running mate in order to have a regional balance and also a political balance. The idea that if the for whatever party, if you have a more liberal Democrat running for president, then you might want to get a more conservative Democrat to be the running mate. And same thing with a Republican. If you have a very conservative Republican that's running for president, you might want his running mate to be a little more moderate or a little more liberal than the president, to appeal to a broader range of people. So the vice president, the first lady also plays an important role. Most all first ladies are, many of them just play a symbolic role. They're there for their husband, showing support and being supportive and hosting dinners and things like that. That's historically been their job. Uh, Probably the first. Well, there's been a few early presidents that had, first ladies that had influence on their husbands. Abigail Adams comes to mind, but probably the first real first lady that was able to overtly do things to help her president and to implement policy themselves was Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's wife. And then later on, probably after her, the first real influential uh, first lady in modern times would probably be Hillary Clinton. She was, highly educated and very policy savvy in her own right. Even, as much so some argue as the president himself, as President Clinton. Now the cabinet is, which there is no constitutional basis for, and Washington kind of created it himself, is basically all the heads of the major executive departments. Okay, you have, under the presidency, there's the, Social Security Administration, there's the State Department, there's the Defense Department, there's the Department of Commerce, and all of those, well, not all of those specifically, the Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Commerce, and Treasury, the heads of those agencies make up the presidential cabinet. That's not all of them, but there's more. But the idea is that all of the major agencies that that work for the president, the heads of those major agencies, uh, cumulatively make up the cabinet, and they help the president and give the president advice and carry out the president's will for the most part. Executive Office of the President, they assist in managing the executive branch, just the everyday work. National Security Council for foreign policy, uh, Council of Economic Advisors for economic policy, obviously, and the Office of Management and Budget in order to plan and implement and get past the president's budget. Now, the White House staff, these are more less policy people and more personal help. They're generally not. They don't have to be ratified or approved by the Senate. They consist of the chief of staff, who is basically the gatekeeper to the president. Uh, Analysts and strategists, those that give him advice on, how to address a certain issue that might come up for the, before the public. Maybe help in speech writing, how to dress, whatever. And then also it includes legal counsel, people who give the president legal advice. Now, the president has many different roles. The presidential roles include representing the interests of the American public. That's the primary role. As I said, Teddy Roosevelt kind of set that precedent. The fact that the president of the United States is the face of the United States and does represent the people of the United States, not only to themselves but to the world. The president is also considered the chief legislator, and while the legislature or the Congress makes the laws, the president has great influence um, in promoting policy and promoting legislation, because he does have what we call the bully pulpit, which we'll talk about. It just means that the bully pulpit is this ability to stand up and speak. And whenever the president decides to speak, the cameras will be there and the media will be there and they will report on it. So he can kind of push his agenda, his legislative agenda, onto the people whenever he wants. He's also seen as a world leader, especially for the Western world, the democratic world, since the United States is the most powerful economic country in the world, and militarily it's the most powerful country in the world. Obviously, the President of the United States will be looked upon by the rest of the world for as a as kind of a guidepost to how the way the world is working. So the president is seen as a world leader as well. Budget powers of the executive branch and the president. Congress is the power of the purse, meaning Congress is the only entity in the national government that can actually fund or pay for parts of the national government. But the president does get to propose his own budget. Since most all agencies fall under the president and in the executive branch, he gets to determine how much money goes to which agency. And of course, what he does is his Office of Management and Budget will make this budget, and they'll send it to Congress. Congress can do multiple things with it. They can sign it and agree to it, or they more than likely they'll change it and send it back to the president. And this back and forth will go on until the president decides to sign it or veto it, or they'll come to some other accommodations. Usually it'll end up being signed, but there's usually a standoff, especially if the Congress and the president are of different political parties. Also, political resources of the president, a reputation for power. Uh, Presidents must protect this reputation for power. They must back up what they say. That's why while you and I, or members of Congress, when another foreign country is acting belligerently, we can say, well, we should just go over there and bomb them if they don't stop it, or we could threaten them and say, well, if China doesn't stop doing this, we're going to, invade them and attack them. Well, other people can say that, but the president cannot say that, because if the president says something, then he has to back it up. So if he says, if so and so country doesn't stop doing this, we're going to bomb them, then if that country does not stop doing that, then we have to bomb them. And so otherwise, then if he doesn't, then the rest of the world will see the president's threats as empty. So anyway, he has a reputation for power. He needs to protect that. Also, popularity is important. Popular presidents can get more done. Unpopular presidents cannot, because presidents need Congress. And if a president is unpopular with the public, Congress does not want to side with the unpopular president, because those people that aren't happy with the president are also voting for the members of Congress. And it works the other way. If the president is very popular, then the Congress members don't want to go against the president, so they're more likely to support and pass initiatives of the president in order to not be opposing a popular president. And then access to the media. That may be one of the most powerful resources. The president has access to the media basically anytime he wants. Television, newspapers, radio, internet, whatever. Uh, he has continuous access to reaching the public. Now, there's been a lot of presidents. Judging the presidents is a great pastime of historians and political scientists. And usually, when determining who are the good presidents versus the bad presidents, there's a few things that come into play. First of all, leadership ability. That's number one. Can you lead? Can you get people to listen to you and follow you? If you can do that, then that's the first step in being a successful president. Can you persuade people? Can you understand public opinion? You got to remember, presidents are generally isolated in the White House and surrounded by their advisors. They don't always know what the public thinks, because they don't walk amongst the public. So when a crisis hits, can they understand public opinion? A good example of this would be Herbert Hoover at the beginning of the Great Depression. Uh, the Great Depression was the worst economic crisis in American history, and Hoover was a millionaire, and he was in the White House, and the average person was out of work, 25% unemployment, and poor and hungry, with no unemployment benefits and no benefits that we might have today, or protections that we might have today. Well, he didn't understand the depth of the crisis. He didn't understand that the people wanted the national government, to proactively help them. And therefore he did not understand public opinion. But the person that followed him and ran against him for re-election was Franklin Roosevelt, who very well understood the feelings of the public. Can you recognize a crisis? Some things, everything seems to be a crisis to somebody, but a successful president, a great president, will recognize what is a real crisis and act accordingly. And hopefully, when he does react, he reacts properly. Uh, if you react properly to a crisis, history will judge you in a positive way. If you react in the wrong way, then history will judge you harshly. Uh, so you really, and most historians argue, you really can't judge a president, whether they're good or bad, until probably 20 to 30 years after they're out of office, because it's by that point that all the decisions they've made have kind of played themselves out. Uh, like President Truman was considered one of the worst presidents when he left. He was very unpopular. But today he's considered one of the great presidents, because the things he did that kind of made him unpopular at the time worked and uh, had positive impacts over time. So, so you really can't judge a president until way, way out after the end of their presidency. And then mobilizing public opinion. You know, once you persuaded the people that your way is the right way, can you get them to react? Can you get them to actively support you? And if you can do all those things, you're a great president. And what generally happens is that you have to have a crisis and react to the crisis properly and mobilize public opinion to support you in the crisis to be a great president. And those that are considered great presidents are those that have done that. And Lincoln is always by most historians considered the greatest president of all time because he did all of those things. Washington as well, Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, and Harry Truman. Those are considered the greatest presidents. The worst presidents by most standards are James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, Franklin Pierce, William Henry Harrison, and Warren G. Harding, all for different reasons, but most of them were just weak leaders. They didn't understand public opinion or they didn't care, and if there were crises, they did not react to them properly. That's especially true for Buchanan and Johnson. Buchanan was the president before Lincoln, who basically did nothing as the South began to threaten to secede and separate themselves. And then Andrew Johnson was the president after Lincoln, who just horribly fumbled Reconstruction and the post-Civil War period. Now we will discuss the U.S. Judiciary branch, or the courts, most specifically the Supreme Court. Now, with regard to the U.S. Constitution and the federal courts, there's not a whole lot that is discussed in the Constitution itself about the courts. Basically, they just create the Supreme Court, and that's it. Even Hamilton, one of the early founders and one of the really the smartest founders and most brilliant, when he looked at the structure of the government at the time of its creation, argued that the judiciary was the least dangerous branch of government. The least dangerous as far as creating a some kind of tyrannical rule or overcoming the other branches of government. Now, the judiciary is described in Article 3 of the Constitution. Article 1, of course, discusses the legislature. Article 2, the executive branch, and Article 3 of the Constitution talks about the judiciary. And it basically, in a nutshell, it says this: judicial power of the U.S. is vested in one Supreme Court. Supreme, of course, being the operative word there. It's the highest law of the land, the Supreme Court, its job is to interpret the Constitution and interpret what it means, so that people know what the Constitution means. Uh, Congressional authority to establish inferior courts. Of course, the U.S. Constitution cannot the U.S. Supreme Court, it's impossible for the U.S. Supreme Court to hear every single federal case. And the founders knew this. And they knew that there would have to be lower federal courts to hear many types of cases. So instead of creating those lower courts in the Constitution, thereby having to change the Constitution every time you wanted to add courts, they gave Congress the authority to establish the lower courts or inferior courts. Also, in Article 3, Section 1, they discuss the tenure of the courts. Basically, life tenure with good behavior for judges on the Supreme Court and in the federal judiciary. Now, this has always been kind of controversial. Why would you want somebody in a position for life? It seems very counterproductive, the fact that there's no accountability there. Well, that's kind of um, what they wanted. They wanted the judges to be only accountable to themselves and to the Constitution. They didn't want the judges to be accountable to voters who don't know oftentimes what the law means and are oftentimes very persuaded by the arguments of the day that may be unconstitutional or by the biases of the day. They don't want the judges to be accountable to um, campaign donations and campaign donors because let's say there's a big campaign donor who this is assuming that, let's say, we have elected judges and they have to run for election. Well, if you run for election, you have to raise money, and if somebody gives you money, then they expect something in return. And what they would expect in return from a judge is judicial rulings that go in their favor, even though they may not be uh, constitutionally correct or judicially correct. So you don't want a judge being influenced by money or by the people who don't have the knowledge of the Constitution and the knowledge of the law that the judge has. But there are ways in which you can get rid of a judge, even though they're in for life tenure, and that is through impeachment. But the whole point of the life tenure is to insulate the judge from outside influences. He's there. He or she is there. He or she can make the decision based on how they interpret the Constitution and the law, without having to worry about what other people think. And I think that's a good thing. Is it perfect? Of course not. But if I had to choose between a judiciary or a judicial system, if I had to choose between judges that have a life tenure with good behavior or elected every so many years, I would much rather have the judges with life tenure, because they are less likely to be corrupted and less likely to be influenced by outside sources. Article 3, Section 2, talks about the power and jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The kind of cases that they can hear. And Article 3, Section 3 defines treason, which is you know, the Supreme Court hears treason cases and requires two witnesses to accuse anybody of treason. Not just one, but two, at least two. Now, just like the other branches of government, the legislative branch and the executive branch, there are checks on the judiciary. Uh, Congress may alter the size and jurisdiction of the courts. So if they feel like the courts are not doing their job properly, they can change the size of it, meaning adding or reducing the number of justices, or they can redefine the kinds of cases that the judiciary can hear. Also, adding constitutional amendments is a check on the judiciary. If the judiciary rules, if the judiciary's interpretation of the U.S. Constitution is such that it goes against fundamental principles, maybe that the American public and Congress or the president deem appropriate, well, all they have to do is go through the process of changing the Constitution. And then the judiciary has no choice but to interpret it under the new amendment. So, for instance, if a really recent case or current controversy is the Supreme Court has determined that their interpretation of the Constitution is that there should be no limits placed on how much money an individual may spend, or a corporation may spend, or an institution may spend to promote and support a candidate for public office. So, in other words, that anybody can spend as much money to try to get somebody elected, which many people, and I would argue most people, argue distorts the democratic process. It gives a lot of weight to wealthy people. Well, the Supreme Court has ruled that that's their interpretation of the Constitution, that that's acceptable. Well, there are some people that want to add an amendment to the Constitution saying that, you know, corporations and wealthy people, or actually what they're wanting to say is states may place limits on how much money people can spend. If they did that and clearly stated states may place limits on how much money corporations and interest groups can spend on elections, then the Supreme Court has no choice but to change their interpretation of the Constitution and what it means with regard to that issue. Because now the Constitution, with the new amendment, says states can do that. Also, a check is impeachment and removal, same process as the impeaching and removing the president. And of course, the president gets to appoint members of the judiciary, and that's a check. So the executive branch has a say who's on the judiciary, and the Senate must approve all of those appointments. So therefore, you've got, even in the process of choosing a judge, there's a check and balance system involving the president and the Senate. Now, the Judiciary Act of 1789 established the lower courts. Of course, the Constitution established the Supreme Court, but then it was one of the first laws passed by the new government under the Constitution established the lower courts. And the courts, the federal courts, which is what they're called, may hear criminal and civil cases. Criminal cases are cases in which a law has been broken, a statutory law has been broken, murder, uh, theft. And they hear civil cases, which aren't necessarily laws that have been broken, but they're usually contracts that have been broken or disputes between people regarding matters other than legalities. Uh, Lawsuits are civil cases. Suing a business for negligence, or actually a divorce is a civil case. So there are court cases that aren't necessarily that don't necessarily deal with crimes. There's a three-tiered court system. You have the district court, which is the lowest level, and they hear original jurisdiction cases, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then they're just above the district courts, is the appellate courts, or called the circuit courts, and they have appellate jurisdiction only, meaning they only hear appeals from the district courts. They only hear appeals, which is a term that describes if somebody feels like that they were convicted wrongly, that justice was not done, that their rights somehow during the trial were violated, then they can appeal to the appellate courts. And then you have the Supreme Court, Chief Justice and 5 associate justices. There were 9 in it was the number was initially the Constitution had 6, the Chief Justice and 5 associates, but that number was raised to 1 and 8, the Chief Justice and 8 associate justices, for a total of 9 in 1869. John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has both, and this is interesting about it. The district courts only have original jurisdiction, meaning they're the first to hear a case, that the juries and lawyers and all that. And the appellate courts have only appellate jurisdiction. Well, the Supreme Court has both. They can be the first to hear certain types of cases, and they also can rule on appeals. Okay, so let's define what we mean by original and appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction is that original. Original means first, and it is the court where the case is first heard. It is where, when you watch a TV show that deals with a trial show, or Law and Order, something like that, original jurisdiction is the type of court that takes place in. It's a court where the case is first heard. You have testimony from witnesses. You show evidence. You have a jury in the box that you are trying to persuade of guilt or innocence. And so you have it's the kind of court, the original jurisdiction court, where that we are familiar with based on television shows and movies. Now the appellate jurisdiction, which rests with the appeals court and also with the Supreme Court, they review the decisions of lower courts. They look at the transcripts and look at all the things that were done in the previous original jurisdiction trial, and they determine if all the rules were followed, if all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted, making sure that the attorneys did everything properly, the judge did everything properly, and that's their job. And they have options once they look at the appeal. They can have the conviction or the ruling by the lower court stand, which means they do nothing, or they can overturn the conviction and say, the judge and the jury and all them, they did this wrong, that wrong, and that wrong, so we're going to overturn that conviction. Or they can revise or change the lower court decision and alter it a little bit based on the facts of the case. So the appellate jurisdiction is very important because it is a second chance for somebody that maybe feels like they got a raw deal in their jury trial. Now, judicial review is another important concept. Judicial review is the power of the U.S. Supreme Court to judge the constitutionality of actions of other branches of government and the states. So basically, judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to declare an act of Congress, an act of the President, or an act of a state unconstitutional. And basically, it's effectively, when it does that, it effectively nullifies that law. Now, this power is nowhere in the Constitution. It was given to the Supreme Court by its own Chief Justice. His name was John Marshall. And it was given to the Supreme Court, this power of judicial review, in the case of Marbury versus Madison. Now, Marbury versus Madison was a case involving something called midnight appointments of President John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist, and he had just lost the presidency in the year 1800. He was running for re-election and lost to Thomas Jefferson, who was a Democratic Republican. Now, the Democratic Republicans also in that election were going to take control of Congress. Well, in the interim period between the actual election and when Jefferson was to take office and when the Democratic Republicans in Congress were to take office, there was a period of a couple of months in between, a transitional period. And in order to preserve at least one branch of government for the Federalist Party who had lost, that the Federalists of Jefferson, I mean of Adams, uh, and the Congressional Federalists, they decided they needed to control at least one branch of government. So in that interim period between the election and when Jefferson finally comes into office, the Congress created a whole bunch of new courts and a whole bunch of new federal judgeships, and they appointed a bunch of Federalists to them. Well, they weren't able to deliver all of the appointments, and so when Jefferson and his Secretary of State James Madison came into office, they were stacked up on the desk. Well, they refused to deliver them because that would have given the Federalists control of the judiciary. And so there were lawsuits involved, and Marbury was one of those that was appointed but didn't get his appointment because Jefferson and Madison refused to deliver them. It went before the Supreme Court, and what Marbury was doing was asking the Supreme Court to issue a writ of mandamus to Madison, forcing him to deliver the appointment. And a writ of mandamus was a power given to the Supreme Court by Congress in a law that was passed. Well, Marshall had a problem. Chief Justice Marshall knew if he ruled in favor of Marbury that Madison and Jefferson would ignore him, and if they ruled, which then that was the correct ruling, was to rule in favor of Marbury because the appointment was official and it was legal. But if he ruled in favor of Jefferson and Madison, then everybody would know that he was ruling in the wrong way, so he couldn't win either way. So what he did, he basically said, I would like to rule in favor of Marbury, but I can't because the law that gave me the power of writ of mandamus, which is the power to force Madison to deliver the appointment, is unconstitutional because Congress had no power to give me that power. They had no constitutional right to give me the power of writ of mandamus, therefore I can't do it. And it's a very simple ruling, but basically what he did, he set the precedent and for the first time ruled an act of Congress unconstitutional. And nobody ever argued. And the long-term impact is that it greatly expanded the power of the Supreme Court to rule acts of Congress as unconstitutional. Now, the federal court system, which is the national court system, and we always have to keep this in mind. There are multiple court systems, multiple layers. You have the federal court system, and then you have 50 separate state court systems. Always keep that in mind. But the federal court system, which is the national court system, is made up of 94 separate district courts nationwide. And there's a map on the next tile that you can look at that we'll discuss quickly that's going to show an example of this. 94 district courts nationwide. No single district may cross a state line. So if you are a district court region, your entire district will be within a state's boundaries. Each state has at least one of their own district courts. Of course, the states with more people need more courts because they have more cases, and the most populous states have four. Uh, and those three include California, Texas, and New York. California, Texas, and New York all have four district court regions, districts. Uh, these district courts are original jurisdiction only. That means they are the trial. They are the trial courts. They hear the evidence. They do not listen to appeals. They are not an appeals court. There's a U.S. attorney for each district, which is much like the district attorney on a local level or a state level. The U.S. attorney is the one that determines, what cases will be prosecuted, what charges will be filed. Now, and of course, the president appoints those U.S. attorneys. On the next level up that we talked about earlier is the Court of Appeals. A loser in the district court, a loser in the trial court, may appeal that decision to the appropriate Court of Appeals, and there's a specific Court of Appeals for each district court. Of course, there are multiple district courts under a single appeals court. So, a single appeals court will hear appeals from multiple districts based on region. There are 13 total, 13 courts of appeals. 11 of them are numbered. And if you've ever watched the news, you probably heard terms like the Fifth Court of Appeals or the U.S. Third Court of Appeals. That's what they're talking about, the numbered circuits, the numbered Court of Appeals. And they're 1 through 11. Okay, those are the ones that are numbered. There are 13, though, so there's a 12th and a 13. The 12th is the D.C. Court of Appeals, and they hear appeals regarding regulatory commissions of the federal government and agencies. Okay, so if it's an appeal involving some agency of the government, then the 12th District Court, D.C. Court of Appeals will hear that. The 13th only hears appeals regarding patents and contracts and lawsuits against the United States. The Court of Appeals has no original jurisdiction and they hear no new testimony. They simply revisit the rulings of the district courts and determine whether everything was done properly. They attempt to correct errors of law or procedure. And the decision is binding on the geographic district. Only Supreme Court decisions are binding nationwide. And each appeals court represents a part of the United States, a region or a district of the United States. So when they make a decision and declare something unconstitutional, or they rule in a certain way, all the other courts within that appeals court district must follow that ruling. And that means precedent. That means that you must follow the precedent. Stare decisis. Stare decisis is a Latin term that means the decision will stand. The decision will stand. Stare decisis, and that makes sure that everybody's on the same page. So if an appeals court rules that the courts must rule in a certain way, then all those courts under that appeals court must predictably rule the way the appeals court rules. And only the Supreme Court, when it makes a decision, does that force every single court in the United States to adhere to the decision that the Supreme Court made and follow its ruling as stare decisis. Okay. Now here's a map that shows the various district courts and the appeals court regions. And just for our own sake, let's take a look at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Okay, that 5. That includes Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Okay, Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Now, as you can see, Texas it's divided with those lines into 4 geographic areas. Those are the district courts. Those are the district court areas. Okay, Texas South, Texas West, Texas North, Texas East. Louisiana has 3. Louisiana West, Louisiana Middle, Louisiana East, and then Mississippi has 2. But they all fall under the Fifth Court of Appeals. So any case that is heard in Texas, Louisiana, or Mississippi, in any of those district courts, if there is an appeal, it will go to the Fifth U.S. Court of Appeals. Okay, and it's just like that under these other colors throughout the map. All those district courts with blue, the Ninth District Court of Appeals, which covers Arizona, California, Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Washington State. Any case in those district courts, if there's an appeal, will go to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers all those areas. Now let's talk about the U.S. Supreme Court real quick. This is the highest court in the nation. Okay, this is the highest court in the nation. They have the final say over any and everything regarding the law. If there are disputes or conflicts within the law, only the U.S. Supreme Court can make a decision that is beholden to all people in the United States. It reviews cases from the U.S. Court of Appeals. Remember that second step from the district, the U.S. Court of Appeals, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. So they hear cases from U.S. Courts of Appeals and state Supreme Courts, because every state has their own separate court structure that has a some sort of a Supreme Court. But it may also hear original jurisdiction cases, usually involving the federal government, lawsuits against the federal government or dealing with the military or something like that. It is the final arbiter of the Constitution. The Supreme Court and its decision ensures national uniformity of constitutional law, meaning each state can't interpret the Constitution in their own way. While that happens sometimes, there are some cases in which we must have uniform laws across the United States. A good example would be laws regarding segregated schools. You know, every state had their own, in the 1960s and prior, had their own, or 1950s actually and prior, had their own rules and laws regarding the segregation of races within the public schools, and and it created major problems. And the Supreme Court made the decision that it violated the Constitution to do that, and all states must adhere to that decision. And so in of course, this specific case being Brown versus Board of Education, outlawed segregation in public schools, and in that ruling applied to everybody. National uniformity of constitutional law, and it maintains the supremacy of national law over state law. Often the Supreme Court hears highly controversial issues, issues on race, segregation, um, you know, abortion, of course, is a highly controversial issue. Gay marriage, things like that, things that are controversial and are a topic of conversation in the nation. Uh, they also hear cases that have constitutional consequences, free speech cases, freedom of the press, due process, things like that. Now, uh, these Supreme Court justices have a lot of help. They have extensive clerk and support help. They have a lot of lawyers working for them. And of course, these Supreme Court justices get to pick their staff. And usually they pick the very top graduates of the very best law schools. So, all you future lawyers out there, the ultimate would be, once you pass your bar exam, would to clerk for a U.S. Supreme Court justice. That would be the ultimate first job. The appointment process, of course, the president makes the appointments, and the Senate must confirm it. So before the president nominates, he's going to take some things into account. He's going to think about competence. Is the person that he or she chooses to put on the Supreme Court competent? Do they know the law? Can they be a good Supreme Court justice? The president, because the president runs with a political party and has a certain ideology, will take ideology into account. A liberal president is much more likely to appoint a liberal U.S. Supreme Court justice. A conservative um, president is much more likely to appoint a conservative Supreme Court justice. Then they might consider broad construction versus strict construction of the Constitution. Broad construction of the Constitution argues that the Constitution is adaptable over time, that it should change with society, that it should be reinterpreted every new generation or so, you know, in the context of what's going on now. Strict constructionists say no. Strict constructionists say that the Constitution, the words written, are strictly to be interpreted in the way they're written, and it doesn't matter what society says today. It should be interpreted in such a way as the founders wrote them. Also, an appointment to the Supreme Court could be a reward for service to the president, helped him get elected, helped him along the way. Religion, race, and ethnicity and gender also play a role, because that's more recent, starting in about the 1960s, to get a Supreme Court that is more reflective, demographically, uh, of the nation as a whole. Because for many, many, many years, for most of American history, it was just white men on the Supreme Court. Now we have uh, black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and women on the Supreme Court as well. Now, after the nomination is made, the confirmation process goes to the Senate. The Senate investigates and researches. They form a temporary committee to do this. Interest groups are going to lobby for or against a nominee because of their previous history with regard to those kind of decisions. The Senate committee hearing will hear people's concerns. Then the Senate votes, and usually the vote is not close. Most all Supreme Court nominees are approved. Now, the Supreme Court and the public, in a 2006 survey, half of Americans could not name one member of the U.S. Supreme Court. And one of the reasons is that there's no television. They do not get a lot of media attention until they make their decision and announce their decisions. And then it's just for a short period of time. It's not like the president who's on TV basically every day. So, there's no television. They do everything in secret. They have very formal ways of doing things. And because of this, the public doesn't really notice. So, for the purposes of this class, I want you to research, find out who the 9 justices are on the U.S. Supreme Court. The 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Research that and find out. And, of course, determine who the Chief Justice is, too. There'll be one Chief Justice, and 8 Associate Justices. Now, here may be the best thing about being a member of the Supreme Court, and that is the fact that the Supreme Court gets to decide which cases they want to hear. They decide their own workload. And so that's probably the biggest perk of being a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, is that you work as much or as little as you want, and you hear the cases you want to hear. But about 8,000 cases are filed annually, meaning there are 8,000 cases that are sent to the Supreme Court asking to be heard, saying, we want you to hear our appeal. 8,000. These 8,000 get reviewed by all the clerks of the different justices, and usually the clerks and the justices they pore over the different cases, and in the end, less than 100 of them are actually heard by the court. But they will choose a whole bunch. Every year they may choose maybe 1,000 or so just to look more closely at. And they will issue a writ of certiorari. Writ of certiorari, which is that means to be informed. And then they will look at the case a little more in depth and determine whether they're going to hear that case or not. And as I said, less than 100 end up being heard. But the criteria for accepting a case, for the most part, is this: it must come from a U.S. Court of Appeals. It can't come from the district court. It can come from a special 3-judge court of military appeals, that separate military justice system. It may, well, I misspoke. It may come from a district court, but is very, very rare. Or it can come from a state court of last resort. That means the state Supreme Court. Then it enters a cert pool and discuss list. And then, out of all those that they've chosen to take a closer look at, the justices all vote on which ones they want to actually pursue and hear in the courts. And it's based on the rule of 4. The rule of 4. If 4 of the 9 justices agree to hear a case, then they will hear the case. So you don't have to have a majority to hear the case. Just 4 of the 9. Now, which cases make it? Which cases go from 8,000 to less than 100? Usually, the federal government's a party in it. That's very common. If the federal government is suing somebody or is being sued, if there's a conflict among the courts of appeals. So you have remember those numbered courts of appeals? If one court of appeals rules one way and another court of appeals rules another way, then that's inconsistency in the law throughout the country, and oftentimes the Supreme Court will have to hear those cases, whether civil rights or civil liberties are involved. Okay, things like Brown versus Board of Education, that's a civil right case. Free speech cases, civil liberties cases, those all are cases that appeal to the justices. Ideological or political preferences of the judges. If there's certain cases that a judge likes to hear, or that was their research area in college, well, they might take a shining to that and make it a preference. And if there's high political or social interest, meaning everybody's talking about it and it's on the news all the time, then they might take that into consideration to hear that case. And of course, also how many amicus curiae or friend of the court briefs are issued in the cases. And an amicus curiae brief is a way for average citizens or groups to appeal to or lobby the courts to get them to hear to rule in one way or another. Amicus curiae briefs. Now, once they decide to hear the case, uh, both sides, the prosecutor and the defendant, or if it's a civil case, one side and the other, both sides will submit briefs ahead of time explaining their arguments. And it gives the justices a chance to think about it, maybe do a little of their own research. So both sides submit briefs. And then after those briefs have been submitted, a period of time passes, and then they have actual oral arguments before the court. Each side gets 30 minutes of oral arguments. Okay, each side gets 30 minutes of oral arguments. That is it. And there's a little light that comes on. A green light, you can talk. A red light says stop. When the red light turns on, you have to stop. Now, at that point, the justices, a Supreme Court justice, may allow you to continue, but you cannot do it without the approval of a justice. So after all these oral arguments are done and questions are answered, they go into conference, which is secret, all the justices, and they discuss it, and they probably ask each other questions and ask each other's points of view, or they may throw chairs at each other. Nobody knows because it's secret. And then they will eventually vote on a decision, and it's a majority wins type decision. It doesn't have to be unanimous. It just has to be a majority, meaning uh, more than half. In most cases, 5-4, 6-3, 7-2, 8-1, or 9-0. Now, there's multiple opinions. Now, one of the most important things once the decision is made, that's important. But even more important are the opinions that are written, which explain why they came to the decision they came to when they voted. And there are really three types of these decisions, or three types of these opinions. One is the majority opinion. That is if the majority of people that agreed with each other and voted the same way, then somebody will write an opinion on their behalf explaining why they made their decision. Uh, Now, it's possible that you could be in the majority but vote the same way as the majority but have a different reason for doing it. If you do that, then you have the option of writing a concurring opinion, which basically means it tells why you said you concur with the decision of the majority but for a different reason, and you explain why. Okay, and then there's the dissenting opinion. These are for the people who voted against the majority and lost. And these are very important, just as important sometimes as the majority or concurring opinions, because it lays the groundwork oftentimes for future cases. So dissenting opinions are very important. And not every judge writes an opinion, but they do have the option of writing it, each of them writing an opinion. Okay, this is just a flow chart showing the federal court system along with the state court system. See, they run side by side, and they each have a lower level trial court, and they each have an appeals court, and then they each have a highest court. The U.S. highest court is the U.S. Supreme Court. The state highest court is a state, usually called a state Supreme Court. And the only way to get through it through to the U.S. Supreme Court through the states courts is to make it all the way to the state Supreme Court and then cross over and appeal into the U.S. Supreme Court. But this little flow chart is really good. It kind of explains the different kinds of cases and how many cases are heard every year. Finally, judicial philosophy and decision making. Uh, there's different philosophies, and we've already talked about a couple of these, but the different philosophies. Judicial restraint. Judicial restraint versus judicial activism. Judicial restraint argues that the courts should allow the decisions of other branches of government to stand even when they offend the judge's own principles. So a justice may say, well, that law Congress passed is not fair. That is not fair to this group of people or whatever. But it doesn't overtly violate the Constitution, therefore we will let it stand and I will not, overturn it. That's judicial restraint. You're restraining yourself from making a decision. Judicial activism argues, and judicial activists make decisions and use their judicial power to further social justice. They will rule because things are unfair or things are not uh, proper in society. And Usually, no judge is purely restraint or purely activist. It usually depends on their own preferred issues and their own ideology. If there's injustice in something that a judge embraces, then that judge for that case will be an activist judge probably. And if it's not something that that judge is concerned with and there's an injustice there, then it would probably be restraint. And then, of course, the strict construction versus broad construction argument that we talked about earlier. Strict construction argues that it's a dead document. The Constitution is a dead document, and that you interpret it as it was written. Broad construction argues it's a living document, and you should adapt the Constitution to the ever changing society in which you live. And of course, you know, you can argue pros and cons for all of these different philosophies and decision making philosophies.